Hello again. The French have little time for the British. True, we do, as they say these days, have history, going back to the Norman conquest, continuing through Agincourt and the Battle of Waterloo. But the real reason for modern friction between the two nations stems from the dreadful massacres we committed against France more recently, during the Second World War. Although Nazi Germany was technically the enemy of the French people between 1940 and 1945, we killed far more French people than the Germans did, as well as reducing a number of French cities to rubble. We all remember D-Day and the Normandy landings in 1944, which supposedly had the aim of liberating France, but not everyone remembers that on the first day of the invasion we managed to kill over 3,000 French civilians, which was far more than the number of German soldiers we managed to account for that day. News in Britain is often dominated by Brexit, the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. The chief players in this drama are Britain, France and Germany. It's only by knowing the past history of these three nations that the relations between them may fully be understood. From the beginning, Britain's relationship with the European project has been dominated by the remembrance of things which happened almost 80 years ago. The very admission of Britain to the common market, as it then was in 1973, was only achieved after a number of humiliating rebuffs by France, led at that time by Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle's opinion of Britain's suitability to enter what he thought of as his club was formed in large part by events in the Second World War. In Europe, the first few decades following the end of the Second World War were poisoned by the memory of the destruction wrought by the German armed forces. In Britain, the Blitz and attacks by V weapons caused bitter feelings against the German nations as a whole. In 1966, when Britain beat Germany at football in the World Cup final, the victory was tinged with a revival of wartime animosity and the feeling that Britain had somehow got one over on a hated enemy. Unfortunately, many French people felt exactly the same way about the British. Although France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, the same day as the British declaration of war, nothing much happened for the next 8 months, the period of the so-called phony war. On 9th of April, Germany invaded Norway and Denmark, and then after a lull of a month, a furious assault was unleashed upon Western Europe. On the 10th of May, German forces swept through Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg and France. The Blitzkrieg or lightning war which followed saw all these countries being defeated. Belgium and Holland were occupied by the German army and France was split in two, with the northern part occupied by Germany and a rump state led by collaborationists established in the south. Because Paris was now in the hands of the Germans, the capital for this supposedly independent French state was established at the spa town of Vichy. Britain feared that a German invasion would be launched from the Channel ports of France, where in fact the invasion of Britain was actually being prepared in the summer of 1940. These ports were an early and obvious target for British bombs. For those living in the area, there can have been little to choose between the bombing by the Luftwaffe during the German invasion and the bombing by the RAF a few months later. These early raids caused few civilian casualties, but that was to change as France's industrial capacity began to contribute seriously to the German war effort. Just as during the Blitz on Britain, bombing factories, which are legitimate strategic targets, results invariably in the destruction of nearby homes and the death of workers and their families. In practice, air raids against German military bases and French industrial centres both caused casualties amongst those living nearby. France suffered far more from destruction from air raids than Britain, about 8 times as many tons of bombs being dropped on France as fell on Britain during the same period, which is to say 1940 to 45. The destruction of French cities was also considerably worse than anything which befell the British. Coventry may well have lost 75% of its buildings, but in some French towns, such as Saint-Nazaire, not a single building was left standing by the end of the air raids. This war of attrition went on for years and killed as many French civilians as the German Blitz against Britain did in 1940 and 41. Things grew even worse following D-Day. Take the port of Le Havre, which was a key strategic target of the British and Americans after the Normandy landings. The thumbnail to this video shows not Hiroshima after the atomic bomb was dropped, but Le Havre after the Allies had finished with it in 1944. On the 5th of September that year, 350 British bombers flew over Le Havre, dropping a combination of high explosive bombs and 30,000 incendiaries. Every building in the centre of the town was blown to pieces and set alight. Ironically, the only structure which was left intact by the end of the day was a solidly built memorial to the 1914-18 war. The following day, 6 waves of bombers dropped nearly 1,500 tons of bombs, together with another 12,500 incendiaries, flattening and reducing to ash the eastern part of the city. On 12th of September, the Germans surrendered and Canadian forces entered the town. Le Havre had been bombed before by the Allies in 1941, and civilians had been killed on that occasion too. In total, bombing by the Allies had led to the deaths of over 5,000 of the inhabitants of Le Havre by the time the war ended, and the town had ceased to exist. The question which is perhaps being asked at this point by readers is why they've never heard about any of this. Even modern sources such as Wikipedia underplay the dreadful events which led to such massacres. After all, carpet bombing a city in this way and turning it to a wasteland of rubble and ash would certainly be treated as a war crime, and yet nobody, even the French, appeared to want to talk about it. What would a young person eager to find out about the history of Le Havre find, for example, if he were to read the Wikipedia article on the town? Merely this: largely destroyed during the Second World War, city rebuilt according to the plans of architect Auguste Perrault, UNESCO listed the city of Le Havre on 15th of July 2005 as a World Heritage Site. Largely destroyed during the Second World War, with not the least mention of who or what it was that did the destroying. Anybody reading that might reasonably think it'd been the Germans that destroyed Le Havre. Although nobody spoke of such things out loud for many years, any nation which has had over 500,000 tons of bombs dropped on it, killing over 60,000 civilians in the process, is bound to harbour some resentment against those responsible. This was certainly the case with Britain many years after the Blitz ended, and it happened in France too. It must always be borne in mind that it was not just Britain but also America which caused so much death and destruction in France, and this has had a malignant influence upon British relations with Europe after the Second World War. When in 1961 Britain first tried joining the European Union, or Common Market as it was then called, the request was firmly rejected by the then leader of France, Charles de Gaulle. The reason for de Gaulle's refusal was simple. He believed that Britain was not truly committed to the idea of being a part of Europe and preferred to be part of the American sphere of influence. It was not until 1973, nearly 40 years after the events which followed the Normandy landings, that Britain finally entered Europe. The awful bombing campaign against France cast a very long shadow.